The sky above the Philippine Sea is a blinding white canvas of heat and humidity. It is June 19, 1944. Inside the cramped cockpit of a Mitsubishi Zero fighter, a young Japanese pilot named Kenji grips the control stick with leather-gloved hands that are slick with sweat. He is 22 years old, a veteran of the Empire, and he believes he is invincible. Below him, the American battleship USS North Carolina cuts through the ocean like a steel knife, surrounded by a halo of black smoke. Kenji dives. The wind roars over his canopy. He watches the muzzle flashes from the American anti-aircraft guns bloom on the deck below. He is not afraid. He knows the mathematics of war. He knows that hitting a fighter plane moving at 300 miles an hour from a moving ship is statistically impossible. He expects the black puffs of flak to explode behind him or below him, just as they always have. He adjusts his aim, lining up the battleship's bridge in his sights. He is ready to die for the Emperor, but he expects to take 1,000 Americans with him. But then physics changes. A 5-inch shell fired from the battleship does not hit his plane. It does not even come particularly close. It passes 50 feet off his left wing. In any other war in human history, this would be a miss, a waste of powder, a lucky escape. But today, the rules of engagement have been rewritten by a secret technology that Kenji cannot comprehend. The shell senses him. It does not need to touch him. It only needs to see him. A tiny radio transmitter inside the nose of the shell detects the reflection of radio waves bouncing off the Zero's aluminum skin. A vacuum tube circuit closes. A detonator fires. The shell detonates 50 feet away. A sphere of jagged, red-hot shrapnel expands at supersonic speed. It tears through the Zero's unarmored fuel tanks. It shreds the cockpit. It turns the delicate airframe into a cloud of confetti. Kenji doesn't even have time to scream before his existence is erased in a fireball. He dies without ever knowing that he was killed by a glass tube smaller than a milk bottle. On that day, known to history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, hundreds of Japanese planes fell from the sky, not because American aim improved, but because the bullets got smarter. This is the story of the VT Proximity Fuze, the weapon that the Allies kept more secret than the atomic bomb because they knew that if the enemy ever figured out how it worked, the war would be lost. To understand why this invention was considered forbidden to use over land for 2 years, we have to go back to the darkest days of 1940, the London Blitz. Every night, the German Luftwaffe flew over Britain, dropping tons of high explosives on cities. The British ground defenses were fighting back, but they were losing the mathematical battle. The statistics were depressing. To shoot down a single German bomber flying at 20,000 feet, British anti-aircraft gunners had to fire an average of 2,500 shells. Think about that number. 2,500 rounds of heavy ammunition fired for one single hit. It was a waste of steel. It was a waste of chemical propellant. And it was a waste of hope. The problem was the fuse. In 1940, anti-aircraft shells used what were called time fuses. A gunner on the ground had to look at a plane through a rangefinder. He had to guess the altitude. Let's say the bomber was at 20,000 feet. The gunner would set a clockwork timer on the nose of the shell to explode after exactly 10 seconds of flight. If the shell arrived at the target in 10 seconds, but the plane had climbed to 21,000 feet, the shell exploded harmlessly below it. If the timer was off by a fraction of a second, the shell exploded too early or too late. The margin for error was razor thin. You had to be perfect in a chaotic world that refused to be perfect. The scientists knew the solution theoretically. They needed a shell that didn't rely on time. They needed a shell that could sense when it was close to a plane and detonate automatically. They needed a proximity fuse. But there was a physical problem that seemed insurmountable. To make a shell see a plane, you needed a radar. You needed a radio transmitter and a receiver.
In 1940, radios were the size of suitcases. They were made of delicate glass vacuum tubes. They broke if you dropped them on the floor. The challenge was insane. How do you put a delicate glass radio inside a steel bullet and then fire that bullet out of a cannon at 2,000 feet per second? The force of firing a 5-inch naval gun is 20,000 Gs. That is 20,000 times the force of gravity. It is enough force to turn a human body into liquid. It is enough force to flatten solid lead. It spins the shell at 30,000 revolutions per minute. Every engineer who looked at the problem said it was impossible. You cannot shoot a radio out of a gun. The glass will shatter. The filaments inside the tubes will snap. The electronics will turn to dust before they even leave the barrel. It was a dead end. Or so they thought.
Enter the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. A team of American scientists, led by a man named Merle Tuve, took on the challenge. Tuve was intense, demanding, and brilliant. He didn't think like a soldier. He thought like a physicist. He realized that glass is actually incredibly strong if it is supported correctly. The team began a series of brutal experiments. They took vacuum tubes and potted them in wax, encasing them in a solid block. Then they dropped them off the roofs of buildings. They fired them out of crude cannons into haystacks. They failed, and they failed, and they failed again. But slowly they found the secret. It wasn't about making the glass harder. It was about packaging. They encased the tiny vacuum tubes in a special rubbery plastic that absorbed the shock. They redesigned the internal tungsten filaments to be microscopic so they wouldn't snap under the G-force. But the biggest problem was the battery. A standard dry cell battery, like you would find in a flashlight, would break under the pressure. And if they stored the shells for months, the batteries would die on the shelf. They needed a power source that could sit on a shelf for years and then wake up instantly when fired. They invented the wet battery. This was a masterpiece of violent engineering. Inside the shell was a dry battery structure with plates. Above the plates was a small glass ampule filled with a powerful electrolyte acid. The ampule was safe and stable while the shell sat in a box. But the moment the gun fired, the shock of the launch shattered the glass ampule. The spinning of the shell, the centrifugal force, pushed the acid outward onto the battery plates. Within milliseconds, chemical energy was released. The battery woke up. The radio turned on. The shell was dead until the moment it was killed. The result was the T-132. It looked like a standard artillery nose cone, but inside it was a miniature Doppler radar. Here is how it worked. As the shell flew through the air, it emitted a continuous radio wave. If the shell was in empty sky, the waves traveled out and never came back. But if the shell passed near a solid object, like a German bomber or a Japanese Zero, the radio waves would bounce off the metal skin of the plane and reflect back to the shell. The shell's receiver would detect this reflection. As the shell got closer, the frequency of the reflection would change due to the Doppler effect, the same physics that makes a passing train whistle sound lower as it goes by. The circuitry inside the shell monitored this frequency shift. When the signal strength reached a specific peak, indicating the shell was within 70 feet of the target, a thyrotron switch would flip. An electric spark would ignite the detonator. Boom! No direct hit required. If you could get the shell within 70 feet of the enemy was dead. The first test took place on the cruiser USS Cleveland in the Chesapeake Bay in August 1942. They launched drone aircraft, simple radio-controlled planes as targets. The gunners loaded the new secret shells. They fired. On the very first run, the drone was swatted out of the sky. It wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. The observers on the deck were silent. They had never seen accuracy like this. It felt like cheating. It felt like magic. But immediately, a new problem arose. The weapon was too good. The military high command was terrified. This technology was light years ahead of anything the Germans or Japanese had. If a Proximity Fuze shell was fired over land and it failed to explode, a dud, and the Germans found it buried in the mud, they would take it apart. They would see the vacuum tubes, they would see the radar circuit, they would reverse engineer it. And if the Luftwaffe got this technology, they could use it against the Allied bomber fleets. The B-17s and Lancasters flying over Germany would be wiped out in a week. The Allied air superiority would vanish. The order came down from the highest levels. General Marshall and Admiral King, the VT Fuze is forbidden over land. It can only be used over the open ocean, where duds will sink to the bottom of the sea, where the enemy can never find them. It was a frustrating order for the Army artillery commanders in Europe, who were desperate for better weapons, but the secret had to be kept. So the Navy got the toy, and the Japanese Empire paid the price. The first combat use was on January 5, 1943, by the cruiser USS Helena in the Pacific. A flight of Japanese dive bombers attacked. The Helena opened fire. The Japanese pilots, expecting the usual flak bursts to be behind them, suddenly found the air around them turning into a wall of shrapnel. One pilot described it as running into a chainsaw. The Helena shot down the attackers with a fraction of the ammunition usually required. The Japanese command was baffled. They couldn't understand how American gunners had suddenly become snipers. But the real shock, the moment where the VT Fuze saved the U.S. Navy from destruction, came during the kamikaze attacks of 1944 and 45. The Japanese tactic was terrifying. Turn the plane into a missile. A suicide pilot doesn't care about survival. He flies straight, he flies fast. Conventional gunnery struggled to stop them because they didn't fly in formation. They came in erratic, desperate dives. But the VT Fuze didn't care about courage. It didn't care about the pilot's spirit. It only cared about physics. As the kamikazes dove toward the American carriers, the 5-inch guns would put up a curtain of radio-controlled death. Observers described seeing kamikazes simply disintegrate in midair. One moment there was a plane. The next moment there was a cloud of aluminum confetti and a splash in the water. The fuse was so sensitive that sometimes it would detonate on the ocean waves if fired too low. But against the Japanese Air Force, it was absolute devastation. The divine wind was broken by a glass tube. Meanwhile, in Europe, the American army was begging for the weapon. General Patton was bogged down. The Germans were dug into the forests of the Ardennes. It was December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans were attacking in bad weather where Allied planes couldn't fly. The American artillery was effective, but standard shells had a huge problem. If you fired a high-explosive shell at soldiers in a forest, the shell hit the ground and exploded. The mud absorbed the blast. The trees blocked the shrapnel. If a German soldier was lying flat in a foxhole, he was safe. The solution was the air burst. You wanted the shell to explode 30 feet above the soldiers' heads so the shrapnel would rain down vertically into the foxholes. But setting a time fuse for an airburst was incredibly difficult. A fraction of a second off and the shell hit the trees or exploded too high. The artillery commanders knew the VT Fuze existed. They knew the Navy had it. They knew it could detect the ground just as easily as it detected a plane. They begged Eisenhower to release it. Finally, with the Germans threatening to break the Allied line, the ban was lifted. The gamble was taken. The situation was so desperate that the risk of the Germans finding a dud was outweighed by the risk of losing the battle. On December 16, 1944, the forbidden shells were loaded into American howitzers. But they weren't aiming at planes. They were aiming at the German infantry hidden in the dense pine forests. The result was a massacre. The radar in the nose of the shell didn't detect a plane, it detected the ground. It was set to detonate exactly 20 feet above the earth. The German soldiers huddled in their open foxholes thought they were safe. They heard the whistle of the shells. They waited for the impact thud. It never came. Instead, the forest canopy erupted. Thousands of shards of hot steel rained down vertically. The foxholes became graves. The tall pine trees were shattered, turning into wooden shrapnel that multiplied the lethality. German prisoners captured days later were in a state of shock. They asked their captors what kind of devil artillery they were using. They said the shells seemed to know exactly where they were hiding. They said it was impossible to hide from the sky. General Patton wrote in his diary that the
funny fuses, as the soldiers called them, had saved the army. He estimated that the VT fuse increased the lethality of artillery by 10 times. Think about that. One gun doing the work of 10. It broke the back of the German offensive in the Ardennes. But there was another front where the VT fuse saved civilization, not just soldiers. London. 1944, Hitler launched his vengeance weapons. The V-1 flying bomb. The buzz bomb. It was an early cruise missile. It flew fast and low, too fast for fighter planes to catch easily, and too small for standard anti-aircraft guns to hit. The V-1s were raining down on London, killing civilians by the thousands. The city was under siege again. Churchill was desperate. He moved all the anti-aircraft guns to the coast. He asked the Americans for the VT fuses. The result was instantaneous. The V-1 flew in a straight line. It was the perfect target for a proximity shell. In the last week of the V-1 attacks, American and British gunners using the VT fuse shot down 79 out of 104 flying bombs. On one single day, they shot down 68 out of 76. They effectively closed the skies over England. The buzz bomb threat was neutralized not by pilots, but by smart bullets. The psychological impact of this weapon cannot be overstated. For the Japanese pilots who had ruled the Pacific skies in 1942, the war had become a nightmare. Their skill no longer mattered. Their ability to dodge and weave didn't matter. If they got within 70 feet of an American ship, they died. It stripped the honor out of the dogfight. It turned aerial combat into a cold calculation of probability. And for the American sailors, the Poco fuse, as they nicknamed it, was a miracle. It meant they could sleep at night. It meant that when the alarm sounded, they knew they had a chance. On the USS Hadley, during the Battle of Okinawa, the gunners fired so many VT rounds that they wore out the rifling in the barrels. They fired until the guns glowed, but the ship survived. The scientists who built it, however, felt a heavy burden. After the war, Merle Tuve, who led the team, was asked about his invention. He didn't talk about the physics. He didn't talk about the clever battery design or the vacuum tubes. He talked about the lives. He said, "I don't want to make a weapon to kill more people. I want to make a weapon that stops the wars sooner." And he did. Military historians estimate that the proximity fuse shortened the war by at least a year, saving hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. But there is a haunting postscript to this story. The technology that saved London and won the Pacific War didn't disappear. It evolved. The radar proximity sensor became the standard for every missile, every anti-aircraft system, and every smart bomb in the modern world. The smart weapons of today, the Patriots, the Iron Dome, they are all the grandchildren of that first glass tube stuffed into a shell in 1942. The VT fuse taught the world a lesson that we are still learning today. In modern war, you don't have to be stronger than your enemy. You don't even have to be more accurate. You just have to be smarter. The era of the night of the sky ended the day the shell learned how to see. Today, if you look at a vintage box of VT fuses in a museum, you will see a warning stamped on the side. Handle with care. It refers to the glass tubes inside, but it should refer to the idea itself. Because once you give a weapon the ability to think, the battlefield changes forever, and there is no going back.